Let's take an in-depth look at one of the presets that uses the BiqMouth. We'll use the Funny Voice preset by Christophe Duquesne, and this is a preset that lets you play, and it has this kind of overmodulated effect on the voice to make it sound funny, and as you move up on Y, you can change your timbre, and there's also a little bit of randomness to this that we'll talk about as well. So let's bring up the preset and just talk about things in general. First off, for those who don't remember about how barrels and gens and shape generators are seen in a preset, and perhaps how we can set the names of the barrels, let's just review that. If you look over on the right hand side, you'll see the formula column. This gives me a shorthand view of what formulas are used in the preset and what components are used in each formula. If I look at the first column after the equal sign for the formula, you'll see some little Roman numerals and some large Arabic numerals. Those indicate for the first column what barrel 1, 2, 3, 4, which isn't being used here, you could see, or gen 1 or 2 in the large numbers, and then shape generators that are defined in the shape generator section. Those are indicated by numbers either in the next column or the W column next to it. If the W column in a formula, let's type C here, uses a multiplier times W, that's indicated by a little red X here, so the shape generator is placed in the column before it. If I have a formula here where W is not used as a multiplier, then the shape generator number is seen in the W column. Now here we can see, if I click on the formulas, some formulas don't depend on other formulas, and some formulas are linked in one way or another, normally as ancillaries to each other, and you can see that if multiple little LED indicators are lit. So here I know that D and H are somehow related to each other, and I can simply go down. A uses barrel 1, B uses barrel 2, C uses barrel 3, D uses gen 1 and shape generator 2, and also is dependent on H, which uses shape generator 3, and the rest of the formulas don't use any shape generators at all. Now if I want to change the name of a barrel or add a barrel, I'll click on the little house icon to bring up my editor. Then I'll go in there and I'll define either 1, 2, 3, or 4, or gen 1 or gen 2, and say equals, and then give it some kind of a name and an optional barrel shape. Here Christophe uses _00, which is the default. If I didn't use that, it would do the same thing. But let's create one of our own, say. Let's create barrel 4, which isn't being used right now, equals rich, and then I'll click done, and you'll see barrel 4 is automatically generated with this same barrel shape 00 that we're using on the other three. I can go in there and add underscore some other barrel type that you can find if you go up top here and look at the cog wheel and then look at barrel styles, and you can then go through all these different barrel styles. You can put underscore and then a barrel style and then say done, and the barrel style that you chose will appear instead of the default triangle. So that's how you create a barrel, and we'll talk a little bit more how to use one that you create for yourself. Now let's break down the Funny Voice preset in steps. As we said in the previous videos, we need to feed the BiqMouth some kind of a complex waveform, normally a sawtooth wave. Christophe uses a different technique here by feeding a modulated oscillator into it. So first let's take a look at how that modulated oscillator is built up. The first thing Christophe does is create an integrated oscillator, and the spectral balance of that, basically the timbre, is controlled by the spectral 1 barrel. Spectral balance of an oscillator goes from a value of 0 to 1, and that's what's set here. Normally a value of about 0.8 is a sawtooth-like sound. Christophe also uses a default recirculator reverb before the outputs. Let's take a look at that basic step. I've disabled all the formulas that don't apply to the step I'm talking about. So you can see an integrated oscillator is created using the default X pitch fingerboard placement function, and formula A controls the spectral balance, which in turn is controlled by the barrel that we talked about. If I click this icon, I can set that to any of my barrel or gen shapes, either range 0 to 1, range 0 to 127, or I can also set one of these other functions we won't talk about here. Let's hear what just this sounds like. a sawtooth-like sound. I've turned on the numeric indicator at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here. If you click a formula and then play, you'll see the value of that formula. And you can see here it's 0.8 something, which is in that sawtooth range. What if I take that and send that to the BiqMouth? I've sent this oscillator to the main outs just for testing here. So let's send it into the BiqMouth. It has a default ah sound since this formula is disabled, and I'll turn on the multiplier and bandwidth so I can get a sound out of this BiqMouth. Turn on the outputs, and let's see what just that oscillator sound alone is going to sound like through the BiqMouth. It's okay, but Christoph is going to do something even more magical to it. The next thing Christoph does is create another barrel that'll control the modulation input to this oscillator. This is going to be used in conjunction with a shape generator that will be set to a Han shape that's a sine-like shape that's unipolar, doesn't go negative, and that's going to let me create some vibrato-like oscillation through this modulation that's going to be very nice. Here I've turned on Formula C, and Formula C, you can see, is controlled by this modulation barrel, barrel 3. That barrel, in turn the formula, which you can see is set to this Han shape, which is a smooth sine-like shape, is controlled by shape generator 1, which is over here, set continuous, where the frequency is controlled by formula I. And I, you can see, only applies to Z, so as I press, I'm going to go from a frequency of 0.9 to 6.3, which means I'm going to get faster as I press harder. This creates a wave-like shape that's used as a modulator to the oscillator, and now if I play, I've sent the outputs to the stereo out of this for testing. Let's play a tone. You can hear as I press harder, I get a faster vibrato-like modulation. And I can use this modulating barrel to increase that depth. There, it's really noticeable. A very nice change in sound to give me more dynamic motion. Let's apply that to our BiqMouth instead. We'll turn on the outputs like we did before. We'll set our parameters so we can get some sound out, and let's see how that ah sound now changes with this dynamic motion on it. There, I don't have to actually wiggle my finger to create vibrato. Christoph has done it for me, and he nicely does it in a way that as I press harder, I get faster, and I can control the modulation to get stronger as well. Now the third and final step in the process of creating the sound that's going to feed into the Formant filter is take the output of the oscillator we just talked about and send that into another oscillator as the wave-shaping input, which is a discrete summing formula DSF oscillator, and the spectral balance of that is controlled by a third barrel, which is called spectral 2. You can see the first oscillator, 1, is sent through Z pressure into this second DSF oscillator. There is no frequency content defined on that, and if you leave the F column blank, that's used as a wave shaper. Now the spectral balance of that is controlled by formula B, which in turn is controlled by barrel 2, and this also is set to go from a value of 0 to 1, and let's see what that sounds like. I've sent the outputs to the mains to test. It's a little creamier sounding, but now I can change the timbre of that with both spectral 1 and this spectral 2. To be honest, that's a great preset in and of itself, but this is what we're going to send in the next phase into our BiqMouth. Let's see what this sounds like if we take that and send that into the BiqMouth with just our default ah shape. This will be similar to what we're going to do in the next step. There, that's really a nice strong sound, and it maintains that vibrato as I press deeper into the fingerboard. Now that we've constructed the sound that we're going to feed into the BiqMouth to create our voice, the next step is to make it funny. And this is done in two ways. The first thing that's done is to use a formula that combines W, X, and Y components to control the Formant multiplier. And from the last video we saw this can drastically change the sound. The second thing that's done is to dynamically change this mouth shape. There's a barrel that's set up that allows you to change it, but also there's elements that are changing it dynamically as well. And we'll take a look at those two things, which are the primary factors that create this funny voice. We saw that we can feed in that oscillator complex that we created, and we just fed it in on Z the last time. Then we disabled our mouth shape and set the multiplier to its default of 1, and this gave us that big ah sound. Almost too strong, and I believe that Christoph realized this, and that's why he used formula F on this and not just the default Z formula, because formula F, as you see, only sends in 0.5 of the Z instead of going to the full unity value. So we'll leave the basic ah sound in place. We'll put back the formula that's used to control the Formant multiplier, and you can see this combines W, X, and Y to create an input into this multiplier. Now, if I just play that right now, I'm going up on Y, and I can hear that change. The funniness is already being imparted. It's using W defaulting to 1. So at some point you see the X ranges from -1 to +1. The Y goes from -0.35 to 0.18. So when X and Y are 0, W will be 1, and that will be the ah sound. So somewhere in there's going to be a sweet spot that if I only play around there, I'll get that ah sound. If I change my Y position on the fingerboard, I'm going to drastically change that multiplier and start going into Mickey Mouse land. And we can see the values, if we look at our display here, are ranging from 0.8 up to 1.4 or so. Anything beneath the unity value on multiplier and above the unity value is going to drastically alter the sound and start bringing on the funny. Now I've turned on the D parameter, that's the main mouth shape control. This is actually going to dynamically change the mouth shape whenever I press the fingerboard. Let's take a look at the left-hand lower corner, and I'll press the fingerboard and play, but I won't release my finger. Look at what's going on here. As long as my finger is down, the value of D stays the same. That is, the mouth shape stays the same, and then we're relying on that Formant multiplier to bring on the funny. Let's just press the fingerboard a few times. There's 0.12, there's 0.7 something, there's 0.5 something, there's 0.1 something. Every time I press the fingerboard, I'm getting a different random value in some range that's being defined by W in the D formula. And the range of that is controlled by my mouth change, Gen 1. So if I take mouth change and I bring it down to minimum, I'm going to always be 0. And that's going to actually set me to my ah. The one predictable thing I can get out of this. I also now, if I take this mouth change and bring it to maximum, you can see my random values now go up to the maximum of 4.8. So mouth change is actually controlling the range of randomness of that mouth shape. So how's this done? Well, D is dependent on this sample and hold of H. We're not taking a random sample of an input of noise, which is common. We're taking the value of H as the random sample. Let's see what H is doing. We saw before that D and H are related. H, well, it's not in the matrix because it was used in the W formula. Let's just stick it somewhere in the matrix so we can see what it's doing. Take a look at our value again. You can see it's using this triangle formula to go up and down continuously at some rate that's defined in my third shape generator. Since the 1 is there, this shape generator is always on. That means that when I go to my D formula, whenever I press W, it's going to sample wherever that triangle waveform is in that shape generator pattern. And you can see that D is dependent on shape generator 2, which is set to single cycle at a frequency that's the longest you can possibly define. Why did Christoph do this? Because he figures no one's going to have their finger down on the fingerboard for that amount of time. Because if this does trigger, it'll go back to 0. Now if I set G, you can see here, to a large number of, let's say, 1 second in comparison to that, and I hold down D and look at our formula output down here, you can see it triggers after a second and goes back to 0. So Christoph wants to put a really low number in that shape generator, so basically that sample is held forever. And that's how we can control this BiqMouth dynamically on both a random mouth shape and this Formant multiplier, both of which adds to the funniness of the sound. Now the last thing that Christoph does to add another touch of funniness is he plays around with the convolution responses. He sets the 0, 1, and 2 responses to 0 and sets the final wood response to a low value of 14. And that's what he actually uses in the convolution interpolation. He sets it to 3 to drive it to that last response, and then he sets his wet-dry mix. But let's first play without that convolution being brought in. And now let's bring the convolution in. It kind of twists it a little more from that full sound to a more contorted, throaty kind of a sound. So let's end by adding the 4th barrel that's missing here. Let's figure something we can do to add a control. The question came up on how do I add controls to presets. I've already talked about this a number of times, but let's do it here. Well, one thing we can do is play around with this convolution response that we just talked about. It's set to this constant. Let's create a barrel so that we can create convolution change with that barrel. And to do that, I'm not going to zero everything out. Let me just bring in a few different settings here. And what I'll do then is create another formula, J, and I'll want to set that to barrel 4, and I know the convolution is going to go from 0 to 3, so let's set this to a max of 3, and then we'll put that as the input to that convolution interpolation. And now of course we want to go in and add our text to the barrel. Barrel 4 equals interp say, and now I should be able to use this barrel to add one more level of change to the sound. You can hear that does change things considerably, and I can play with my convolution responses to see how that might change. You get the idea. That's one thing I could do. Maybe I could play with the bandwidth and put a control on that. But that's how simple it is to add a control to a preset. Just figure out what you want to do, figure out what your formula that needs to be applied is, create your barrel name, and then set it to your control. That's a pretty darn simple thing to do once you get a little bit comfortable working with the matrix.